Hey guys, it's Gracie. I'm 35 weeks pregnant and nesting pretty hardcore. I started taking on some woodworking projects as well as just the regular cleaning and stuff, getting stuff ready. So here is a farmhouse style dining room table and chairs for our new house. I picked it up off OfferUp for 75 bucks and I'm going to be showing you guys how I got this finish from this original set. I'm sanding the top down here, starting with 80 grit on an orbital sander. You can pick those up anywhere, even on Amazon for like 50, 60 bucks. So I'm starting with an 80 grit, then I moved to a 120, and then I finished it off with a 220 grit. You want to be really careful sanding around the edges. Most furniture these days are made with veneer, and you can burn through it really quickly on the edges. I was not super careful, and that happened in a few spots. So doing it over, I probably would have used just a piece of sandpaper, and hand sanded it. So veneer is like a nicer piece of wood, very thin, laid out on top of shittier wood, basically. So it took about 2 hours to sand the top. It was a huge job. And I'm just going in here and getting the finer detail stuff. There was also a leaf under this table, but whenever I first set it up on this makeshift workbench, I couldn't release it. I couldn't figure it out. So I ended up not refinishing the leaf, so it is not going to be an extendable table anymore. Anyway, so it is split down the middle, so I made sure to clean out all the sawdust from there. I'm just wiping it off with a lint-free rag and then going in with a tack cloth. A tack cloth is just a piece of cheesecloth with a little bit of wax on it. You can get them at the hardware store or Amazon. Now I'm going in with some paint thinner and just really cleaning it up very well and prepping it for the stain. You can use different solvents. It's kind of optional, actually. You don't have to do this step, but you could use mineral spirits, acetone, denatured alcohol, paint thinner, lacquer thinner. It's just on the bare wood just to clean it really good. Now I'm going in here with an oil-based stain. This is Varathane's Smoke Gray. And to get the look I achieved, you would do probably 2 coats. I ended up doing more. I'll explain that later on in my blooper section. So you could do probably 2 coats and leave the stain on for maybe 10 or 15 minutes before wiping it off. I wiped mine off immediately, therefore I needed to do several coats to get the dark gray color I was looking for. You can use a rag, a foam paintbrush like I'm using here, a regular paintbrush. It's harder to clean oil-based products out of brushes, so a lot of people will use just something disposable. I preferred the rag method, which I used on some of the later staining steps. So you'll see how light it is here. This is just the first coat of stain, laying it on and wiping off the excess immediately. And I wanted to show you guys, even though I'm only suggesting doing 2 coats of stain to get this look, I'm showing you how dark it got after every step for me. So anyways, I sped up this entire process to just make it so the video wasn't super long. So this is the second coat of stain. I'm still gonna just lay it on and wipe it off immediately, but you can see the color, and you can always test it on a, well, I don't know what you would test it on, I guess a corner of the table or maybe underneath the table if you wanted to sand it down. Actually, no, it's not going to be the same type of wood, so forget I said that. So this is after the third layer of stain. You don't need to do anything except for clean off any dust buildup. You don't need to buff or sand in between coats. You just need to wait. I would recommend 24 hours, but I think the can says like 6. But I was doing a coat a day. Anyways, now I'm going in and sanding the chairs. Now there's no veneer on here, it's just solid wood, so I didn't have to be as careful on the edges. It was a huge job to sand the chairs, especially to clean up in between the spindles. I tried 2 different Dremels and they didn't do very well. They took off too much. They dug too deep, even on the low settings with the very fine grit, the high grit sandpaper. So I ended up doing all that by hand, and it took a long time. So I'm just going back in, same process as the table here after sanding, just cleaning it really, really well with a rag, tack cloth, and then some solvent. Prepping it for the stain. These are shop towels. It's like a lint-free paper towel. So I'm applying the first coat of stain here, and I'm not being too careful as I'm going to be going in and repainting all the white parts. So I'm just using a little rag here, and it was soaking up the stain really, really good. So I went back and just put another layer on before I wiped it off because I really wanted that dark look. Then I let it sit on there while I did the rest of the chairs, and then I wiped them off. On the chairs, it only took 2 coats of stain for me to get that matching look that I got on the table. Now I'm going in here and just cleaning up all the parts that I'm going to be painting on the table, the legs, the chairs, everything. I'm using TSP in warm water. You can pick that up at the hardware store. It's just like a degreaser, very heavy cleaner. Okay, so pause for a second. If you guys wanted to go back and see, you'll have to pause the video. I just put in some tips on how to tape off the spindles on the chair. I really went back and forth so many times on how I should be doing this. Should I stain first, paint first? But this was the most effective way I found whenever I was researching on how to tape off the chairs, which again was a very meticulous job, but it had to be done. Now I'm going to be applying 3 coats of white chalk paint to the skirt and the base of the table, the chairs. The first coat, I just laid on brush strokes in any direction, no big deal, just get it on there. And the second coat, I'm a little bit more careful with the brush strokes, so I'm like following the grain, going in all the same direction. And then for the third coat, I took a 320 piece of sandpaper, a little sanding block, and just smoothed it out very lightly before going in with that third coat of paint. Then I wiped that off with a tack cloth, and now if you can see here, I'm just wetting my brush a little bit to try and thin out that chalk paint. That's going to help eliminate some of the brush strokes, which was the point of it. So that third layer is just going on a little bit smoother. I go in with wet paintbrush after I apply the chalk paint. So there's no paint on this paintbrush, just a little bit it's just a little damp. So I lay all the paint on, and then I damp a new brush, not a chalk painting brush, and go back over it. This clip is out of place. It should have been before I painted the third coat. But I explained all that. So now I'm going to be waxing using a clear furniture wax and a rag. Everything that I painted. Chalk paint needs to be sealed to protect it. It's like an ultra matte. Feels kind of chalky. And so you need to use some kind of a sealer. Most people use wax. You can also use polyurethane or a water-based polyurethane, like a polyacrylic or something like that too. So now I'm just revealing the stained part of the chairs, and despite working so hard to protect that area, it still got a little messy around the bottom of the spindles. So I just took whatever sharp object I had handy, which were scissors, and I cleaned up some of the paint. And then I went in just with a rag very carefully. You could probably use a Q-tip with some acetone. Maybe even nail polish remover with acetone might work. Anyways, I took off a little bit of the paint that was on the stained area with acetone, but that also ate away at the stain, unfortunately. So I just went back in with a little bit of stain on a very small rag, just in between the spindles to make sure it was going to continue to match the rest of the seat. And then I took a small paintbrush and just, where it took off a little bit too much paint on the bottom of the spindles, just retouch up the paint. This process took me about 30 minutes to do all 4 chairs, and I was glad I did it. I was glad I took the time because they look really good. Now I'm going in here with some mineral spirits to clean up the stained part before I apply this sealer on it. I chose a wipe-on polyurethane. I made it myself with regular oil-based polyurethane. I mixed 50-50 mineral spirits and poly. The straight oil-based polyurethane, it's really thick and I didn't have great luck applying it directly with a brush, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So after a lot more research, I learned about this, making your own wipe-on poly, and it was so much more effective. So I'm just rolling up my rag. Instead of taking like it bunched up, I roll it up into a neat little bundle, and that's how I'm applying it. Some of this did get on the bottom of the spindles, but it wasn't a super big deal. I just kind of wiped it off with my finger as I went. I did 3 coats of this. That's probably equal to 1 coat of regular wipe-on poly, or regular brush-on poly. It's about a 3 to 1, so it goes on a lot thinner, it really penetrates into the wood. So I might end up doing more coats now that we're moved into our house, but the movers were coming to pick up the furniture and I didn't have a lot of time to do any more coats. You can do probably 2 to 3 coats a day, about 4 or 5 hours in between recoating for wipe-on poly. And this has since become definitely my favorite way of sealing chalk paint instead of using wax. It does require many more coats, but I just find it's really therapeutic to apply, and I don't have to be very careful. Of course, I have to be careful working around these very tight spindles, but for doing furniture, you don't have to really watch for brush marks or bubbles or anything like that. It's just pretty mindless. I can just shut off my brain and apply it, and it only takes a few minutes to do each layer, so it's not a big deal for me to go in and have to do several layers. You're definitely gonna want to do more coats of the wipe-on poly on a tabletop, something that's going to be getting a lot of wear. Same with the seats, so 3 definitely isn't enough. I'm going to have to for sure go back and do some more. Anyways, this is the final product. Now, I'm going to share with you guys everything I did that I shouldn't have done or that I screwed up and had to go back and fix. It was a lot of stuff. So here goes. I started off by trying to strip the varnish off the table and chairs. Well, it turns out that there's this important substance in paint stripper that has been banned since 2019, and basically paint strippers suck now, especially for this really thick varnish, the really shiny varnish. I mean, probably on paint or maybe even like a dark stain it would work, but yeah, it didn't do much here for me, so I should have just gone straight to sanding. So that was the first waste of time, money for babysitting and products that hit me. It was the very first step I did, and it failed, so that sucked. But it worked a little bit better on the chairs, maybe because it was solid wood. I don't know. Maybe there was just less coats of it, of the varnish. But the table was pretty rough. Now I went in here with a paint thinner. You can use, well, this afterwash is like a turpentine paint thinner, just a cheaper version. And I went in with steel wool to try and get all the stripper residue off. So you could use several different solvents, and I have them listed here. All right, same with the chairs here. I had to go in and clean them up before I did any sanding because I didn't want to gunk up my sander or the pads on my sander. Okay, the next thing, this was a huge waste of time. I wanted to originally do epoxy on the table. So you see like the glass bar tops, or if you've seen colored epoxy or epoxy inlays, I wanted to do clear epoxy on the tabletop. So I did a lot of research, learned how to use it, and I ended up being too scared to do it after ordering a bunch of product, like 150 bucks worth of the epoxy, enough to do the tabletop. You have to flood it in a really thick layer. Anyways, I ended up being too scared that I would screw up my entire project because the epoxy wouldn't look good. Like I've never done it before, right? So I didn't want to practice on something smaller first because I wanted this project done. So with the specific brand of epoxy I was using, Pro Marine, you can only apply that on water-based product, so not oil-based stain. So I had to seal it first with a water-based polyurethane. This is a polyacrylic. So I had to let the oil-based stain dry, like cure, for a good like 8 to 10 days before going in and starting to apply several coats of water-based poly. I had to sand down each coat of water-based poly in between. You'll see I'm using a 320 sanding block and cleaning up the table. Now, you don't have to sand or buff wipe-on poly in between coats. You also don't need to sand or buff in between coats of oil-based stain. That's something that I wasted time on as well. I wasn't educated on, so I learned that in the process because I was lightly sanding each coat of stain in between. So anyways, I'm going in here and I cleaned off the stain with acetone before the first coat of water-based poly, and it went really well. So after sanding down that first coat of poly, I went back in with acetone just to clean it up really good, because using epoxy, you can't have any oils or fingerprints or anything on there. Well, turns out epoxy eats away oil-based products, so that sucked. My OCD like totally made me finish cleaning the table with epoxy even though it was eating away at it. So I went back, resanded the surface, and had to just do another coat of poly. So that sucked. But I learned a lesson, and I was able to use it later, knowing that acetone eats water-based products. I used it to clean up the chalk paint off the stained seats of the chairs. So it was okay. Anyways, I decided I didn't want to use the epoxy anymore, and I wanted to use an oil-based polyurethane on the table. So I learned how to apply oil-based polyurethane on top of water-based polyurethane, and that's what I did. So this is just showing everything that I screwed up. And what have we got next here? Oh yes, sanding. Okay, I used an orbital sander to sand down in between coats of oil-based poly. I wasn't always using this wipe-on method. I was using it full strength for the first couple of coats with a brush, and man, did it ever look like shit whenever it dried. So it was just really kind of tacky, and it wasn't curing all the way. So I was sanding it down, and I thought I could use my orbital sander and just not put too much pressure, but that was a huge mistake and a huge lesson learned. That's my toddler. And so it ate through all layers of poly by using the orbital sander, and the stain too, like bare spots of wood started showing, and I was just devastated. So I didn't know. I didn't have time to do research. It was like an on-the-spot decision, a troubleshooting thing. I didn't know if I could, but I applied more gray stain onto it because if you'll see here all the bare spots, I wasn't going to continue sealing it like that. It looked like shit now. After spending weeks on this project, I was pretty heartbroken. But I just said, screw it, and I applied another layer of stain. I let it really sit in there before wiping it off, and it ended up being fine. So learned something new there. And I just went in on top of this with several coats of wipe-on poly, and it was okay. And what else do we got here? The chairs, yes. So I, just like the table, I started with applying the oil-based poly using a brush to the seats of the chairs. And then I waxed. I decided while Griffin was with a babysitter and while they were still wet, right after I applied the poly, that I was going to wax the chalk paint, the spindles in the top of the chairs. That was a huge mistake because even though I thought I was using lint-free rags, I wasn't. And a lot of lint fell from the rags because I was using a rag to apply the wax onto that wet surface, and it looked horrible. I had to sand it all down in between sets, and it was a huge waste of time. I should have just... Oh, Griffin's starting to melt. I'll have to let you guys go in a sec, but I should have just started off with the wipe-on method to begin with, but again, learned a lot.